The final days of April and the first days of May 1945 saw the German capital of Berlin engulfed in chaos and destruction. The city, once a symbol of Nazi power and ambition, now lay in ruins, a testament to the ferocity of the Allied assault and the relentless advance of Soviet forces. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble, and the streets were filled with the detritus of a fallen empire. Soviet forces, having pushed westward across the Eastern Front, were closing in on the heart of the collapsing Third Reich. The Red Army, driven by a desire for retribution and victory, moved through the city with an unstoppable force. Their advance was marked by fierce street-to-street fighting, as German defenders, many of them young and inexperienced, made desperate last stands in a futile attempt to halt the inevitable. Amidst the rubble and despair, a broadcast from the German radio service on May 1st, 1945, confirmed the news that had been both rumoured and dreaded. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Nazi Germany, was dead. His suicide in his underground bunker was a final act of defiance and cowardice, leaving his followers to face the consequences of his catastrophic decisions. The announcement, delivered in sombre tones, sent shockwaves throughout the remnants of the Nazi regime and across the battle-scarred continent of Europe. Soldiers and civilians alike were left in a state of shock and uncertainty as the reality of their situation began to sink in. The once mighty Nazi war machine had been brought to its knees, and the dream of a 1,000-year Reich had turned into a nightmare of destruction and defeat. It marked the symbolic end of a regime that had plunged the world into the deadliest conflict in human history. The fall of Berlin was not just a military defeat, it was the collapse of an ideology that had caused untold suffering and loss. The streets of Berlin, now filled with the debris of war, stood as a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked ambition and hatred. Yet, the seeds of Germany's defeat had been sown years earlier, thousands of miles to the east. The vast expanses of the Soviet Union had proven to be an insurmountable challenge for the German military, and the brutal winters and fierce resistance had worn down the once invincible Wehrmacht. The war that Hitler had unleashed, fueled by his insatiable ambition and twisted ideology, would ultimately consume him and his 1,000-year Reich. His dreams of conquest and domination had led to a war that engulfed the entire world, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. While the fall of Berlin marked the final act of the European theatre of World War II, the true turning point had occurred years earlier. The battles of Stalingrad and Kursk had shattered the myth of German invincibility and set the stage for the eventual Allied victory. To understand the magnitude of Germany's downfall, we must journey back to June 22nd, 1941, a day that would forever be etched in the annals of history as the beginning of the end for Adolf Hitler and his Nazi regime. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was a gamble that would ultimately lead to Germany's ruin. The vast and unforgiving terrain, combined with the fierce resistance of the Soviet people, turned what was supposed to be a swift victory into a protracted and bloody conflict that drained Germany's resources and morale. On a seemingly ordinary summer morning, the world stood on the precipice of a cataclysmic shift in the course of World War II. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the relative calm of the early morning hours was shattered by the roar of artillery fire and the thunderous rumble of tanks. Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler's long-planned invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun. This audacious military gamble, involving millions of German and Axis soldiers, stretched across a vast front spanning from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. It was a breathtaking display of military might and logistical complexity, aimed at crushing the Soviet Union and securing Hitler's vision of a Nazi-dominated Europe. The invasion of the Soviet Union was a monumental blunder, a strategic overreach that would ultimately prove to be Hitler's undoing. It was a decision born out of a toxic mix of ideological fanaticism and strategic miscalculation, one that would have catastrophic consequences for both Germany and the Soviet Union. The initial German assaults came as a devastating surprise to the Soviet leadership, despite numerous warnings from intelligence sources. The sheer audacity and scale of the attack were beyond what the Soviets had anticipated, catching them off guard and unprepared for the ferocity that was to come. Caught off guard by the sheer scale and ferocity of the attack, Soviet forces reeled under the onslaught of the Wehrmacht, Germany's highly trained and well-equipped military force. The German strategy of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was executed with ruthless efficiency, leaving Soviet defences in disarray. German panzer divisions, spearheaded by tanks such as the Panzer IV and the fearsome Tiger I, sliced through Soviet lines, exploiting gaps in defences and wreaking havoc in their wake. These armoured behemoths were supported by mechanised infantry and artillery, creating a formidable force that the Soviets struggled to counter. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, gained air superiority in the early days of the campaign, relentlessly bombing Soviet airfields, supply depots and troop concentrations. This dominance in the skies allowed the Germans to disrupt Soviet supply lines and communication networks, further crippling their ability to mount a coordinated defence. The skies over the Eastern Front became a maelstrom of aerial combat as German fighters, including the nimble Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the rugged Focke-Wulf W190, clashed with their Soviet counterparts. Despite the bravery and skill of Soviet pilots, the Luftwaffe's superior tactics and technology often gave them the upper hand in these dogfights. The initial weeks of Operation Barbarossa were marked by a series of stunning German victories as they advanced rapidly into Soviet territory, capturing vast swathes of land and inflicting heavy casualties on the Red Army. The speed of the German advance was unprecedented, with entire Soviet divisions being encircled and destroyed. The speed and ferocity of the German advance left the Soviets reeling, struggling to regroup and mount an effective defence. Soviet commanders were often forced to make desperate decisions, committing their reserves in a bid to stem the tide of the German onslaught. Despite their efforts, the Red Army was pushed back, suffering devastating losses in both men and material. The impact of the German invasion was not limited to the battlefield. Civilians in the path of the advancing Wehrmacht faced unimaginable horrors, with many forced to flee their homes to escape the violence. The human cost of the initial assaults was staggering, with countless lives disrupted and communities torn apart by the relentless advance of German forces. In the face of such overwhelming odds, Soviet soldiers displayed remarkable resilience and determination. They dug trenches, set up defensive positions and prepared for the inevitable clashes that lay ahead. Despite being outgunned and outmaneuvered, their resolve to defend their homeland remained unbroken. The initial assaults of Operation Barbarossa set the stage for one of the most brutal and devastating conflicts in history. The battles that followed would test the limits of human endurance and reshape the course of the Second World War. The Eastern Front became a theatre of unimaginable suffering and heroism, as both sides fought with unrelenting ferocity. The early successes of Operation Barbarossa can be attributed to the Wehrmacht's mastery of blitzkrieg warfare, a tactic that relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force to achieve rapid breakthroughs. This method of warfare was designed to shock and disorient the enemy, making it difficult for them to mount an effective defence or counterattack. German panzer divisions, supported by mobile infantry and artillery units, would punch through enemy lines, encircling and isolating pockets of resistance. These armoured units were the spearhead of the German advance, moving swiftly and decisively to exploit any weaknesses in the enemy's defences. The Luftwaffe, operating in close coordination with ground forces, would then rain down bombs on enemy positions, disrupting communication lines and sowing chaos among the defenders. This aerial bombardment was crucial in softening up enemy positions before the ground forces moved in to secure the area. One of the most notable examples of blitzkrieg in action was the Battle of Minsk, which took place in late June and early July 1941. This battle showcased the effectiveness of the German strategy as they managed to encircle and trap a significant portion of the Soviet forces. German forces surrounded and destroyed a large Soviet force, taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners and inflicting heavy casualties. The sheer scale of the victory at Minsk was a testament to the efficiency and ruthlessness of the German military machine. This devastating defeat sent shockwaves through the Red Army and demonstrated the effectiveness of German tactics and the fighting prowess of the Wehrmacht. The Soviet leadership was forced to re-evaluate their strategies and make significant changes to their command structure in response to these early setbacks. The early victories of Operation Barbarossa seemed to confirm Hitler's belief in the superiority of German arms and the supposed inferiority of the Slavic people. These triumphs bolstered the morale of the German troops and reinforced the Nazi ideology of racial superiority. However, the Führer's hubris and his underestimation of the Soviet Union's resilience would soon prove to be his undoing. Hitler's overconfidence led to strategic miscalculations as he failed to anticipate the Soviet Union's capacity to regroup and launch counter-offensives. The vastness of the Soviet Union, the tenacity of the Red Army, and the approach of the brutal Russian winter would all conspire to bog down the German advance and ultimately turn the tide of the war. The initial rapid gains made by the Germans would be gradually eroded as the Soviets mounted a fierce and determined resistance, leading to a protracted and grueling conflict that would stretch the German military to its limits.